For those of you who don't know me, I'm Hernan Diaz Alonso. I'm the graduate programs chair here on SCI-Arc. One thing I'm going to do, a couple of things I'm going to try to make different than the usual thing. One, first I'm going to tell you in advance that our discussion is going to be only 25, 30 minutes. So then there's plenty of time for you guys to ask questions to Barbara about her installation here. And the second one is to give you a little bit of context in from which angle I'm trying to ask you questions about this, which I think in the past it has not been the case. So I'm gonna ask a couple of specific questions about the specificity of the problem to work in a place that you have a long story with, one way or another, which I think is a tricky thing. But the first, and also is for those of you who have not been in one of these, part of the exercise to do this installation in the gallery is for our students to work with architects and realize and fabricate and build, but also to put architects in the position that we put our students all the time, which is kind of an open critique or a jury about the work of an architect. So in relation to that, let's say I'll start with one of my let's say more asshole questions of the night, and then I'm gonna go down into softer and nicer, hopefully, or maybe not. We'll see how it goes. But the first question is because I was looking into your work, and we were discussing this in my office, and it seems like not that your work can be divided clearly into two categories, but it seems like in the relation between into the self-standing complete buildings, I would say are in one logic or one species, and then some of this work that you did in interiors belong, in my view, to a kind of a more, so the self-standing building I would say are more hard and rigid and to an extent more recognizable language in relation to the tradition of architecture. When it goes to interior, you think to work in a more soft ambience or are kind of qualities into the work. Now, this installation seems to me that it's trying to negotiate that bridge, and again, I'm probably completely wrong about that, but what the hell? But also, I would ask another question, which is, not another question, but I would say the main question in relation to that is a question I will ask every architect that does an installation here. And I will say in the previous 10 years, we can divide the people who did shows here into, I will say, two kinds. One, the one that they seem to be more close to kind of experimental practices. The installation in the gallery seems like a natural extension of what they were doing. And people who I will say they have a more committed professional practice, which I would like to think that your work belongs to it, they use this more as an opportunity to go to an extreme that usually they will not go in the regular work. And it may be this is a completely unfair question, but I would like to start with this one. If that is a fair assessment of this particular piece of work in relation with the overall of your work.
If that's the hardball question, this is going to be really not so bad, I think.
No, it's not the one. I say they start there.
Oh, this is the generic, obvious question.
Yeah.
I guess I would say this isn't too much different. I mean, it may be different in terms of its sort of extreme graphic quality from a lot of the stuff that we do, but one of the things that we do in my office a lot is kind of deal in super graphics and the graphic as part of the built environment. And so this project was certainly trying to be a hybrid on the one hand of a kind of a formal language, which that I think is different than what we normally do. This whole sort of dodecahedron, unfolded, et cetera thing was something that was maybe more of a contextual response to, say, SCI-Arc or the solar decathlon building outside or something like that, being evident of this sort of obsession with certain kinds of forms at a given moment. And then the unfolding of it and sort of turning it into like a construction project is more the kind of stuff that we do a lot. And I like the generic sort of 2x4, 2x6 plywood, et cetera. But yeah, so I think that in a way the part that is maybe the most noticeable, like the graphic and the mirror interplay, is sort of something that is actually something I could point out in a lot of different projects, and that maybe more formally it's kind of a different configuration. But to me, I would actually I look at SCI-Arc installations also in two categories, but a different set of two categories, one of which is architecture as an object, like things that are an object in the room and you come and look at it, and then the other one that are spatial environments. And from the beginning, my goal was to make a particular space, because I feel like it's not that it's harder, it takes more material, obviously, to sort of define the whole parameter, but I really didn't want to be doing an object to be looked at, and that was sort of not that it isn't, but it sort of does double duty, I hope.
Well, I think that brings me to the other part, which is, I will say that it's clearly that the ambience intention is there, but I would argue I'll still read this as an object. And I will say a fundamental difference, which I don't know if you want to comment on that, it seems to me that some of the formal work that you do, it has been more established to what I will call a strong form. And this project belongs to what I will call weak form. It's a kind of a more contemporary project in relation to the weak form, the idea of form to have that kind of a lack of reading as a presence. But because for me, the graphics and the mirrors is not the one I register the most in this particular.
It's not what?
It's not what I register as the main thing. For me, the weak form or the unfolding of the thing is to me like the main feature of the piece. But do you have a position in relation to that, to move from what I would call a strong form to weak form?
Well, I always liked the idea of weak form, because back when we first heard about it, when Eisenman and Kipnis were talking about weak form, I was in college and I would go to these lectures, and at the time they adopted weak form as this feminist position, and they actually described themselves as female because they were using weak form. So it was sort of an
incredibly pejorative on their part.
It was interesting. Yeah, at the time, I think phallo-logocentric is what one would have called it. But nonetheless, it was sort of so I actually sort of enjoy thinking about the historicity of avant-garde forms. And so in that sense, when I started working on this one, I originally had actually much more straight, what you would maybe call, I forget what you called it, hard building or something like that. Let's say a modernist. Platform. Yes, I had sort of a pretty straight kind of envelope that I was looking at, because I was interested in the kind of situational aesthetics, like the idea of bringing people together and having this disco, which to me that was always the big thing, that sort of students, like making this space that would provide this other kind of space in a time where, as someone who's teaching now too, like we have a lot of students who are spending a buttload of time next to a computer, on a computer, and not actually doing anything else. So some kind of other environment was sort of the program that we set. But the big issue for me really was what form might work in this particular context. So I kind of, the way I was thinking about it was using form like almost like a hermit crab shell, where the crab can kind of come along and inhabit different sizes or different shapes of shells depending on the body of the crab. But that in that sense, it was meant to be a kind of, again, a contextual response, like what would work, what would be the appropriate thing at this moment. So I was looking at there's a sort of ontology of the dodecahedron that's rather popular these days, whether it's, you look at Dürer and you look at Giacometti, and then you have the Herzog and de Meuron Prada Tower, and you sort of over and over again. I think last semester I remember someone was doing grasshopper scripts that would just create zillions of dodecahedrons at the press of a button. And so I thought, to me, it was almost that part of it, I wasn't at all interested in it as in terms of its formal beauty, but more in its kind of historicity or kind of appropriateness to the contemporary moment as the kind of form that this thing should be. And then breaking it open was actually came more out of the building issues, like actually building a giant enclosure seemed kind of retrograde, and also it was being done in the parking lot already, but I also felt like spatially it didn't give us enough space to have this sort of environment. So it was only about a month or two ago that it kind of turned into something that was broken up and kind of unfolded the way that it is.
But I want to stay on this subject of form for a bit, because I will, one point or question will be that, because I think one potential risk in terms of the way that the project is operating is, I will say, had to do with the problem of style and the word of style, which many times we consider a bad word, especially in an academic environment. I'm not so sure it's a bad word per se, But I think in the relation between the super graphics that I think is working and the particular, I would call it the formal stylistic language, not that I think your project is trying to operate in what I will call the decon, but there is a kind of a stylistic thing about the breaking part and so on, which I'm not so sure, to me, that's where I try to figure it out, the sense level of contradiction between the project, between the desire to create an ambience and the desire to create a space, but then at the same time to subject that hypergraphic to almost a formal stylistic manipulation of it. And I'm not so sure if that pay off, because I will wonder if you put the same super graphics in the existing condition of the gallery without adding this frame, it will still work on some level or not. Or because I think for me, as I said, the formal part of it, or the stylistic part of the formal manipulation, I think it has a much more aggressive role at the end than the hypergraphics. I just asking if that was something that you predetermined, or it was more a byproduct of the process. You showed me this fascinating evolution of the project. You have many iterations. I wonder if the last one became almost like the natural consequence of it, or became like a specific thing to put those two things almost, or I would say, in conflict. Because to me, what I was working today, again, I gave it to you, I walked through the day by myself. It's probably totally different when it was in the opening, full of people, and so on. But if that conflict was something that you were after, or was kind of a byproduct, or more like a craftsmanship of doing it?
Well, that's a tricky one. I mean, I definitely do not think it would work. The surfaces in the blank space would function differently. Some aspect of it would work. I mean, part of one of the threads of thought and the reason for using the razzle dazzle and the whole sort of background of that is this idea of virtual form. You know, that by using the graphics, in this case, this piece right behind us is meant to be read from the entry point as something that's sort of popping out at you, which it actually sort of does. You know, and the lighting is right in the photographs, and to some people, you can't really tell if the walls are folding more than they actually are because of how the graphics are organized. So there's a fair amount of work in terms of how these would, you know, where the painting is and then what it's doing. So the fragmentation, say the decon aspect of the unfolding is actually it's kind of simple to me. I mean, it is literally the unfolding of the Pechakura model that we were using to build the solid. I mean, that's why there's flaps and everything on it. It's literally taking that model and unfolding it, putting it in the space, and then building that. That I love that about it, that it's not a particularly wrought, worked over thing, and that's partially why it has some more jagged edges, you know, than it needs to. It's not you know, trying to be aggressively deconstructivist, but I think that I guess what you're asking me sort of is can one exist without the other, or which is really the determinant language or something like that. And I think that spatially, probably the floor is the thing that makes it the fact that it has a floor, is like the thing that makes it a dance floor, you know, makes it a particular space. But the thing that ended up, I thought, being the most successful part of it, and certainly at the opening that was the case, was the secondary program, which is this sort of pink peripheral hidden spaces, you know, which has been a topic in architecture for quite some time. But you know, the kind of the left behind spaces, or the spaces, you know, the liminal areas. Like the fact that I was able to get something that liminal areas, that's when I thought, oh, this actually worked. So even if whatever this looks like, it's making this whole other secondary program, which I think is working to some degree. So that's something new for me, and work-wise, I haven't gotten to do liminal space before.
It brings me to two quick questions. One, to keep hammering on this thing of a style, because when you unfold them, I would like to think that there's a kind of a reveal of the construction. I mean, you didn't cover that part with the same graphics that in the front, so I would assume that there is some kind of a desire about, or some, I don't know, not that it's an indexical quality, but it works to a level in an indexical way. That would be, if that was intentional for some reason, or it was just a byproduct of doing it. And the second one, I think, I agree with you, I think the floor got most of the game, but then will ask me, why not the ceiling? Why you decide not to to give a complete sense of environment, why the ceiling remains what it is.
Well, so the original design was for something that was a floating enclosure that essentially was, dodecahedron, igloo, whatever, but floating above the ground, so that you'd walk in and you'd just see people's feet, and that was there'd be the space outside and the space inside. SCI-Arc doesn't really have any calculations on its beams up here, and structurally speaking, that's a even bigger deal than we were talking about. So again, so then we started working on this thing that was sitting on the ground, which was kind of getting boring and object-like, and then again taking the models that we had been making and just unfolding them with their tabs and everything, sort of how this came to look the way it does. I think that would have been maybe a more totalizing environment, but actually also the fact that Patrick's exhibit that was up before us, which I thought was a really great, effective, kind of meditative focus space, that which I saw, right, well, we weren't done by the time that was up. It's like, okay, definitely, I don't want to repeat that experience, because I think that actually worked very nicely as a phenomenological experience also for students, like sort of chill out thing. So this was intentionally open also so you could see it from above, that I was sort of hoping people would just climb in at night, down the back, because it's sort of set up like a ladder, and there's a jack that you can plug your own iPod into. The speakers are all wired and on all the time, just so you know. You could technically use it as a disco at any time. Like it's meant to kind of be slightly available for whatever. And so in that sense, something that was an enclosed thing that would control the environment more would have been a different thing.
Okay, you mentioned disco, so let's go into that a little bit. I mean, I'm 42, so I was very young at the peak of disco, but I knew something enough to have the T-shirt that says "fuck disco." So I was not really a disco guy. I mean, I don't look like too much like Tony Manero kind of guy. But there are two things in relation to that which I think are interesting. One is the poster of Bianca Jagger. One I have to do, which I will say, one of the ambitions that this project has, and I'm not quite sold that it achieves, it has to do with the notion of sexuality, which is a big deal in disco when you hear all the stories. But that's, I would say, the superficial aspect of disco. And then I'll go back to another comment about disco. But this notion of the sexuality, and I don't know how much it relates to the weak form. I really forgot about there was a feminine.
Does it come from feminism, supposedly?
No, I forgot. No, you're absolutely right. I forgot about that part of the conversation, that the weak form was a feminine form. But maybe there's a way for you to start to tie that up. But as I said, I think there's an ambition with the text and with the title and the posters and the mirror maybe, but I still am not completely sold about it. Maybe I'm wrong, and the sexuality was never part up front as an agenda, but it's clearly in terms of the desire how the thing is framed that they have to do with that. Was that an issue or not?
So are you asking me if it's meant to be sort of sexualized, or are you telling me if it was supposed to be, it's not?
I'm asking if that was an issue or not, or I mean, I would make a distinction between sexuality and sensuality and all the things, but if there was a clear ambition to work with that or not.
I would say that
and if
the
so,
disco.
How?
Okay, so here's a couple ways. Like, one is that the disco itself, like if you look at any film on, say, the history of Studio 54, aside from, I mean, there's Bianca Jagger as this kind of bearer of arms or whatever of disco era, and quite a character. So that was sort of a useful, let's say, author or inhabitant or something like that for this. But really, what is kind of amazing about disco or New York in that time is that it really is actually much more radical culture than anything else going. It's like it's where gay culture first kind of came out and became sort of the dominant culture for a while. So yeah, I mean, I'm 44, so I also have the punk rock background, although I think I liked Anita Bell too much to ever say disco sucks, but it wasn't like I wasn't planning to come here and play my Donna Summer records. It was more embracing or appropriating that kind of idea of, let's say, hedonism, but tying that, which I think ties very clearly into kind of a more politicized stance, into how can you do that sort of with architecture and maybe more with students. Like I really do think that the idea behind this is sort of have like a kind of liberation zone for students that is a little bit, obviously it's like behaviorally, but also that architecturally, this isn't the, this is made very sort of brutally. It's very rough. It's very, butch, you could say maybe, but it's that's kind of at least the construction of it. I think to me there's a very clear difference between the back and the front. And the front is the interior is meant to be the surface, and the rest of it is meant to be kind of built like a set, like as simple a thing as possible, which is why you get the liminal space beyond that. So this is the kind of center stage, and then there's a sort of whole back room, and some people like the back room part, some people like there's the Bianca Jagger, and there's the other kind of personality on the back.
I mean, I think you touch on that. I mean, one of the things, because again, as I said, when I had that T-shirt that says Disco Sax, I didn't know enough to understand that actually disco was part of a counter-revolution. And
isn't that like a Steve Miller Band T-shirt anyhow?
Yeah.
Disco Sax.
I don't even remember. No, it was a Kiss thing. It was Detroit Rock City era, and the record of Kiss came with that T-shirt. So like Kiss was not disco, but in any case, there was something about when you really look at the early stages of disco, not when it became, as I said, a kind of a caricature, almost a stylistic joke for movies like 20 years later. But at one moment, like you have Blondie and even Chic and the Ramones, they were all playing in the same clubs, and they were part of all the same scene. To an extent, as I said, the most hardcore gay, as you mentioned, a scene was nurtured into certain days of discos and so on. The question to me is how much of the and I think you maybe touched, but to reemphasize on that, the certain rough quality or raw, the certain materiality of it, with the mirror and so on, it has to do to try to reconcile that. Because in one way, automatically when we have those lights, it says disco. But then there is a lot of other things that if you look at all the discos, all the discos, all to an extent, the caricature of it, it became more like a smoke and mirrors, and there was no physicality into it. The physicality, by 78, let's say, physicality was gone.
Like a black warehouse with some stuff in it.
Exactly. So how much did that play into the argument, to the idea that was, because particularly with the mirrors, which I think right now they're working. I don't think that maybe that was not the intention. I think the mirror trying to mean other thing we have to do with depth, and it had to do more with kind of an architecture effect. But at the same time, to an extent, it may get reduced only to a kind of a disco effect. So how that is, if it's possible to conciliate that? Because, no, sorry, I'll let you.
Well, I may not answer it correctly or the way that you're asking it, but I think one thing that I think is radical about this project in the current context of these things is that there's a huge amount of milling and laser cutting going on to make this. Like every single freaking piece of plexiglass is, 4,000 pieces of plexiglass are laser cut, and all the plywood sheets are CNC milled, and everything's numbered, and it's sort of, but again, to a kind of such a simplistic, like an effect, that was definitely intentional, like a kind of that there was using some of that material as a tool rather than a generator. Although one couldn't have done this, we originally thought we would do this, really superficially with sort of 3M tape or something, but that was too thin in a way. So this is now an 1/8 inch thick instead of, a millimeter thick. But there was something about that was sort of the smoke and mirrors part of the disco. Like I think if this didn't have that layer, if you were talking about what would the space be like if it just had the graphic layer on it in the gallery itself, one could also posit what would this thing look like if it didn't have any graphics on it. It was just a bunch of plywood, and it would look like a kind of, maybe Donald Judd decon kind of what thing. And the materiality wasn't really a big part of it in terms of the plywood. It just sort of ended up working for that kind of balancing act of let's say, sort of symbolic reading of materials. Anyhow, but yeah, so I think maybe this is meant to be the space of the idea of disco, not a replication of an actual disco, because again, you can see that anywhere in Las Vegas any time now. That did become the warehouse with special effects in it became the new thing.
I mean, the Donald Judd, I think, opened the door for later for Joe. He's gonna come from that angle, I guarantee you.
glad you guys are setting this up in advance.
No, I mean, I just pointed out. And maybe this is not the last point, but I think maybe we should kind of open it to the people to ask something after this one. But one thing I really appreciate about the piece, which I enjoyed a lot, is that they reivindicate the notion of fun and play, which is something that many times in many installations, sometimes architecture try to take too seriously. But in relation to what we were talking, there are parts of moments in history and culture that fun and play can be associated with a very heavy cultural component. I mean, as I said, the beginning of disco or the beginning of punk, they almost start with no agenda. It starts as a series of accumulation of, I would say, maybe micro-aesthetics or micro-sensibilities, and then amount into something else. But the risk, I will say, in the case of disco, is that it went away quite fast. It's basically, culturally, you can almost say 75 to 78, 79 with a lot of effort, but the 80 was gone. And it was a reaction, especially music, it was a reaction to the old symphonic rock of Yes and Genesis and all that. It was incredibly boring and dense and so on, to understand. So it was an excess of virtuosity. But then these things, you have to have almost, like punk music as well, you have to have like a very short life to become that. If it became longer, the fine and play, it will completely disappear, and it becomes an intellectual argument to understand. So the thing I'm trying to determine is how much of the fine and play that the project have an ambition, it had that intention, okay, it will be like 2 or 3 things to change the discourse on something in direction, and then the discourse will take over and the thing will left behind, or the fine and play is like a stealth operation that try to aim to a kind of a deeper, kind of a more permanent intellectual discourse, in this particular case, the discipline architecture to stay. Maybe you don't even care about this, and maybe I'm just fishing too much into it, but.
Well, I would like to think I was going for the latter, but I think that would be, that is sort of a question, like whether it's legible that way or not. I mean, I think that's sort of the questions that you're asking. I mean, certainly to me, it's an appropriation of something that.
The question if this is a kind of a predetermination in the work, or you look that the work will have that as a byproduct. You predetermine what are the meanings. I mean, these are the values, these are the things we're going after, this is what we challenge or not. Or the work has their own intention, their own ambition, fine and play, and hopefully, as a byproduct, it will take a life on their own. This is more like a way how you approach, in general, but particularly this project, the way that you approach your work.
Well, I would say the issues that this project has in it have been around for about a year, and that part of, I was showing Hernan this diagram that we had in the office that was sort of all the highways and byways and roads not taken that we went along on the way to get to this thing, including like a forest of scaffolding that had people living in it, and we had all kinds of stuff. But it was sort of, the idea was always a little bit like I've been very interested in the situational aesthetics thing, except that I actually don't like them. Like I think situational aesthetics is incredibly boring from a 3-dimensional, visual, environmental point of view. Like it's just not that interesting to see or look at. Although I think socially, and the kind of idea of make these things where people confront each other or have these kind of odd discussions in a staged setting, I think is really interesting. So I kind of had that in the background, like a thing, making something happen somewhere that would create a different kind of social interaction, and that from the beginning was this idea of a disco, that like a dance floor is kind of an easy one for college students, grad students, whoever. It's fairly open. Enough people have gone to weddings with their children and their grandparents where you sort of imagine anybody can get on the lit floor. But I also, as I got more into it, I kind of do think that I guess that the aesthetic politics of things like music are really useful to look at architecture in terms of. And I'd been looking a while ago at the whole sort of, Kraftwerk, which would be, say, in your terms, the high modern, music choice, and its relationship to, say, Detroit techno, which wouldn't really have an architectural equivalent at this point, since architecture culture doesn't really go there usually. And then the kind of different marriages that come out of that, whether that's whether it's hip hop or whether it's whatever, but the idea that you can kind of have these structured, like bass can kind of become a dominant theme in music over 20 years or 30 years, which it didn't used to. Like that to me is a kind of architectural concept that I am interested in, is the kind of stuff I like to think about. Hence, like the dodecahedron operating a little bit like something like that it's been sort of appropriated and reappropriated, and now, it's unfolded, but it's kind of like as if you were a music producer, doing a such and such record, and you're like, okay, this one I'm going to do, this kind of a record. Like, this is not the R&B track. This is going to be the party track that gets the most radio play. Like that. That's to some extent a little bit of how one can think about this kind of context.
Probably the last question I have. I was thinking I can go with two ways. One is go with a kind of a completely unfair generic question, which is, how do you know that it's right or it's wrong what you did? Which is, I always find it completely stupid, so I'm not going to ask that one. So I'm going to go into a kind of a more specific, kind of a compulsive disorder problem that I have. I want to ask you, how do you determine what patterns keep going from floor to walls? Which one stops? I mean, how do things, that's the thing I was looking today when I was walking in, that it was driving me nuts, because I was trying to figure it out, what was the criteria to make those decisions, and how much the super graphic is encoded into the formal ambition of the project, or the graphic have their own entity and just get deployed in whatever the unfold is. Or, in other words, how close the weak form, the graphics of the black, and the graphics of the circles of the mirror are in correlation, or the three of them, they're independent thing, and somehow they're fighting for their lives in controlling the project.
Well, it's interesting because I would say that probably 3 or 4 different people did the different graphic panel layouts. So there's actually that one over there is somebody, I think in particular that one. This one is the one I was focusing on the most because I was trying to recreate the special effect that was on this one World War I warship that we were looking at, the official razzle dazzle thing. So there was a kind of a calculation once the model was built as to how the thing would deploy in space. There's a calculation of what if you come in this way, you're looking at that panel, and there's a certain effect that you're meant to see that's meant to become three-dimensional, and again, confusing as to whether or not the panels are doing it or the paint is doing it. And this one has the clear one from that end. And so the ones on the side they don't have objects embedded in them. Originally, we had each of them had a three-dimensional object sort of hidden in each panel, but in a way that none of the other ones weren't viewable in that way. So they become more part of the larger context in a kind of a Escher way. That it's a pattern based on how the lines shape to the different forms that are the different folds that are happening, but it also exaggerates them so that if the lights were dimmer, you might really not know how many folds. Does this panel have 3 folds or just 2? Would be harder to tell because it could just be the lines that were moving, so on. So I guess, does that answer your question? Ish.
Good enough. I think we've been going for 40 minutes. Maybe it's a good time to open to questions from the people in the audience. So we have time this time, and we don't run out of time for that. We have any. You have to go with the Donald Judd, Joe. You don't have a choice.
What can I say about Donald Judd? It reminds me a lot of Donald Judd's friend, Frank Stella's work in the disco era, sort of like late early Stella, where you start to get a lot of pattern and superimposition. And I guess my question really is about what I was sort of kind of ruminating on as I was listening was this kind of shift in strategy, or this kind of constellation of strategies that seem to govern a lot of the teaching that goes on in our field right now. And at SCI-Arc, I feel like a lot of the discussion over the last 5 or 10 years would have a little bit to do with brokering between what I think about as strategies of recombinance or recursion, iterative strategies or collage-based strategies, and whether you're working by putting disparate things together and looking at how they interact, or whether you're developing some primitive into more and more possibilities. And really what I was thinking, Barbara, was that this really is operating from a different paradigm. And I think to the degree that it's clearly about transposition or superimposition, and a kind of repetitive superimposition to the point where even different people's sensibilities are coming into play for the different, for any number of the different this idea of kind of field on field on field on field process, I think, is really, I think you've kind of staked out really novel territory there. I think you've also kind of gotten it to deliver on your ambitions for it in terms of how the space works. And happily, I don't feel like I'm in a judge box at all. Other than, and actually, it's funny, taste-wise, the wood grain was sort of the trickiest part. I wondered if it needed to be wood. And frankly, I don't necessarily think it does, but that is one of maybe, 3 or, probably more like 12 than 3 or 4 different surface conditions that are commingling to set up this field you're interested in. So my question would be, I'm going to build off Hernan's last one, not his first, but this question of pattern and continuity. I feel like I've had a lot of conversations about the Seattle Library and why and where Coolhouse decided to take the pattern around that building. Why when you unfold it, it does and where it is and isn't coincident. And to the degree that you build off of the floor, I wonder if do you see the patterning of the floor unifying a fair number of the do you see it as environmentally unifying, or does it, as I'm sitting here, simply kind of take you from end to end into this with the sides kind of operating in a different register?
I think the materiality of it certainly is unifying in that that it's elevated, that you ramp up into it, and then visually it is intentionally somewhat anamorphic, so it is organized so that if you went for the primary entrance, there's a very particular perspectival effect that goes up to this wall, and that would be the primary view, to the extent that rather than the thing being necessarily open, I mean it's open to multiple views, and obviously there's a whole back spaces, etc. But it is organized visually, and I think the painting reference, I mean the Stella I hadn't really thought about, but the first person that I was thinking about all last winter, whenever we started on this, was sort of Bridget Riley and the idea of retinal burn. And the idea always was that the space would create a kind of visual retinal burn in whoever came into it. And I honestly, if I'm going to look at what does work, that doesn't work, we had a really hard time trying to get the lighting in here to work in a way that would create a kind of visual, like a visceral effect, visually. And it's still, when it's really dark and we had the whole sort of laser agenda, it's pretty hard to create visual burn, especially on a large scale, it turns out. If you put headphones or glasses on or something like that, you could do it. But so I was always looking at color, and this was always meant to be multiple colors and not really about something like plywood. I think I like sort of what Julian Hober said about Donald Judd when he did the Mystery Spot project at the Hammer recently. I'm forgetting the actual name of it, but he used that language of minimalism in art as a kind of a appropriated context that was, by mixing that with kind of the folkloric special effects aspect of that warped space, somehow had a conversation then with kind of minimalism's limitations, say, or it's the fact that it exists as a kind of it's like a fashion language or something like that. And I think that that's something that I don't like that this ended up having a little bit of that if it did. But what we did was actually tons and tons of tests of colors and patterns, and this was originally red, and then there was red and bright yellow, and and all these different things, and it's kind of, there's a sensibility that operates just about whether it's going to end up being a circus read, or is it going to be a disco. If it was really a disco, it would just be painted all black, maybe with the mirrors embedded. But the idea of having that kind of camouflage going on necessitated a second pattern. And anyhow, but that was probably like a month of solid work as sort of what is the pattern, is it material, is it paint, what are the mirror stickers, are they mirror, how many mirrors are there, how big are they? There's a lot of testing. We had a mock-up of one of these in our parking lot for a while. It takes a long time to build these things.
Any other?
How are the acoustics? It's very bouncy in here. When you put the music on, it's like, oh, you could use some soundproofing on the ceiling, I think.
Well, until we get somebody else. Joe touched on one thing that is, for me, is the most disturbing thing, is the wood. The wood is to me, is the plywood, to me, is kind of the most awkward part of the whole project. Nature disturbs me always, but but I also start to think this is like a disco in the way that it will be in the middle of Tennessee or something like that, like a country disco. No, but I'm interested in that because I'm not so sure until what point there is a kind of a desire of, I will say, the signifier to call it, that's what keep it to be architecture and don't became completely a stage set or a makeup thing. So I don't know, there was some kind of intentional quality to keep some minimum of, I would say, honesty when it came to the material that it was necessary for the project to operate in that level or not. I mean, if you will paint the other part into yellow or red, everything will be, not that the plywood is the most natural of wood, but nevertheless, there's kind of a meaning into that. Again, I don't know, sometimes things are simpler than that, but if that was something like it was an intentional thing to keep this to become the possibility to become something that operated when the discourse, instead to become just a pure series of collections of effects.
You mean it would have succeeded more as a collection of effects had it been painted also, right? I mean, which I agree. No, that's what I was saying.
No, I'm just saying if there was a kind of a specific desire to say, okay, no, we're going to keep this wood because we need to keep some level of honesty.
I don't think it was that, because I think, as I was saying, this is the area that I think is probably problematic. It is a little bit, I would say for me, it is probably familiar territory to operate in the world of plywood a little bit, and so that's the part I think is kind of tricky, because I like the backside, and I like the fact that this is more or less a surface, and I have to say I felt that that the mirrors were going to be the agent of dematerialization, but they kind of needed some material to dematerialize. If say, the Korean people were generous and had just wanted to give us Korean, then this would look very different. It would have a kind of a sleekness that would be different, but for the most part, all of my spatial and kind of social intentions would maintain. Like, it could easily have been in Korean, and then we just would have had this different thing. Only problem is there was the physical fact of something that people could walk on. Because for a while I looked at drywall as an option, just cleaning up. So I think though that it is it's baggage that is
actually, to me, is one of the most compelling part of the project, because it's that kind of a high low end working together is what make it into different territory. I think if this was Korean, it was super slick, whatever, it would be Disco 78 Studio.
Or like
you know what I mean? This is more like a Studio 75. No studio, it's Disco 75, Blondie playing next to the Ramones. It had more that potentially to become more part of the discourse and less of just a collection of effects. But that's what I was asking. That was clearly intentional, which just ran out of money. And which, hey, that's part of the design strategy as well.
No, this was part of the month or so of mocking up different things, and I think that it did end up reading, like, you can't really dematerialize something that isn't material. So in that sense, it kind of had to be materialized. But I do like that it has you see the front, you see a finished face, and you see it's ACX, so you see the back face, which is a totally different kind of surface, but it's just one material.
The 2 a.m. and the AM face all in one.
Yeah.
Bill.
Yeah, Barbara, it seems to me as though there's two ways that this space works. I would like to come back and see it with nothing, and to get its full effect.
You feel lonely.
As they should be. The other thing is, I'm really sorry that I missed one all the people here, because then I think it works in a completely different way, because the floor essentially wouldn't mean anything at that time. But the movement of the people, the texture, would, I think, play very well with the surfaces and the way the surfaces seem to undulate. And I'm wondering what your feeling was as you had everybody in here, as all the people here.
Well, I think one of the most successful things for me was that people, if they stuck around long enough, then they would figure out that they could walk all the way around the whole back of it and up the bunk bed, and there was people like up over there hanging around, like with their heads popping over it, so it became more of of a play structure, and that was sort of always, that adult play thing is sort of part of this idea of the hedonism, or like this kind of antidote to kind of architectural production as a the relationship between a person and their computer. So that, to me, that you can't really have hedonism by yourself very well. Like, it's not very fun. So yes, I thought it was. But I like I kind of like the two. I like it sort of just as a as a Lilliputian kind of scale issue. Like, if you're in here by yourself and if there's no one else here, it's a very tall, unfolded little cardboard model that's just totally oversized, and that's meant to be, the proportions are intentionally kind of dwarfing the individual, but if there's a lot of people in it, that doesn't matter. It becomes more of a container for.
One of the things I like most about it, Barbara, is that it really does seem to pit the informal against the unformal. I think you are really doctrinaire about staging informality, but I don't think this project is a protest against formal seriousness. And I think in a lot of respects it sort of touches on a lot of questions that aren't so far, I think, from some of the questions that are not asked in this work, or that drive a lot of the high discussion in our field. And I do feel, frankly, that a lot of the work that is more about informality stakes out, really tries to argue against all formal seriousness, and I just feel like, in terms of how this space gets shaped, and having kind of taken on this question a couple years ago, you've developed the whole rescaling and occupiability. And I would say this, though, when you were in here, actually the fact that you rebuilt the floor and the kind of bounce that you get to it, the way it's a subtle lift, but you shift in the space. It's pretty. There are all these different moves that really do register, whether it's a lot of people or just a few in different ways. And all of that, to me, seems intensely formally acute.
Thank you. I think the thing that we got the most props for at the opening was that we had the bar inside. There's a bar area over there that was lit and everything, and I was like, well, thank you very much. Yes, that was sort of that it had that built in. Thank you, Joe.
Anybody else? Well, I want to thank Barbara for coming and doing this with our students. Great job.
Thank you,
Thank
Hernan.
you.